and it gets a little hard to make things work. So the advantage of having frequencies above that, they're less crowded, they're a lot easier to make use of, and we can have some fun with it and do some experimentation. So, why HamWAN? We can't really blame it on the governor of Washington, but whenever we have an opportunity, we would like to. So, basically, one of the things he came out with here end of last year, well, 2 years ago now, because we officially clicked over, was a recognition out of the Cascade Rising exercises that we're not as ready as we'd like to think we are. And so there was some kind of recognition out of that. So he basically came out and said, okay, I need you to develop a proposal for basically fixing the communications black hole. If you've ever worked in drills of any large scale sizes with communities or government entities, hospitals, fill it in. If you've worked with emergency communications, you know that communications is one of the weak links that seldom gets tested sufficiently. And one of the main reasons is you go talk to any hospital administrator that wants to conduct a large, massive drill. One of the big reasons is they don't want to test communications, because if it fails, and they know it will, then the entire exercise has failed. So another reason why they don't often test it as well as they should, they know that it needs to keep working on, but it's always usually run separately from the rest of your drills in order to have those other areas progress. So one of the things that Washington Governor Inslee came out and said was, okay, we need things to be able to still work following an incident. And so, you know, some of their baseline assumptions, if you've worked in this, they're pretty standard. Landline telephones, cellular networks, broadband cable networks, they're going to be down or severely damaged. You know, they'll either be out or really reduced capability. Infrastructure that's in-ground or crosses bridges and overpasses, it's going to be degraded or totally fail. Microwave systems will be shaken out of alignment. I'm going to put an asterisk on that one because we'll talk about it a little bit later. And what they used to say was prepare for 3 days, 72 hours. Well, they're now stretching it out to 2 and 3 weeks, which, you know, from a church standpoint, we have folks in the church that have nets on our repeaters up there, and you guys are probably a bit more prepared than most of the population realizes. And so kudos to you for that. So some of the system goals that he kind of threw out for his little urge to get departments and everything working. Communications between the Washington State Operations Center, EOCs, and cities, counties, so on and so forth. State Patrol, Department of Transportation, Department of Health, DNR, Natural Resources. Main reason for that is the DNR hosts, their locations host much of the communications infrastructure. So that's the reason for that. DSHS, and of course the acronyms go on. So basically allowing everyone to communicate amongst themselves. They like to come up with a system that can work right away, be expanded as needed. 20 simultaneous conversations. How many think 20 is a big number in a disaster? Not really. You can have 20 out of one location. 20 is going to go away in a heartbeat. This is a starting goal for the state of Washington. 20 people being able to talk to each other at the same time. That should give you an idea how much more preparation work needs to be done. Capacity for 2 simultaneous conference calls involving 50 participants each. Handheld devices, and the list goes on and on. So I'm not going to go through the rest of the thing because we'll come back to this in a little bit. But it's a fairly substantial list, being able to communicate in and out to you guys down here in Oregon, Idaho, BC, National Guard armories, maritime assets, so on and so forth. So anyhow, that's kind of a starting set of goals, and the reason I throw that out there is as we go through what you're trying to set up here in Oregon with your own little HamWAN setup, you'll discover that a lot of this can take care of a lot of those needs. Where we're going to go. We're going to start out with some basic networking. We're not going to get too deep into it, but like I said, there'll be an opportunity for everyone to catch some Z's. So, you know, find the section that applies to you and feel free. Just, you know, if you get snoring too loud, we may have someone just kind of throw an elbow. Yes, sir.
Can we get access or to where this might be as a PDF?
Sure. Yep, not a problem. And then we'll talk a little bit about HamWAN itself, some of the highlights from last year, where it's going, and then we'll get into what you actually need for hardware, some of the local mapping and coverage issues for what we've been looking at with the tower situation down here, and we'll be able to do some questions and answers and some ad hoc stuff if we want to start looking at things like that. So, like most good tech manuals that have a page intentionally left blank, sometimes the mine is best left intentionally blank. As I get older, I find that happens more frequently, so it resets a little bit. So, connection between two or more PCs. What is a network? Well, that's what it is. You got two computers sitting on the desk. How do you make them talk to each other? Wired or wireless. It could be either direction. Most things are wireless these days. Heck, in the old days, they always used to have a wire or tin cans and a string. Like a house on your street in your neighborhood, each device or computer, tablet, smartphone, whatever on a network has to have a separate address. That's how the mail, or in this case, computer traffic, gets from point A to point B. If you're wanting to talk to me, I need to know where you're coming from and where to send the mail back to, or the computer traffic, if you will. So that's kind of the demonstration of that on the bottom. You got 3 PCs hooked up there. The first 3 numbers are common between them, and that is termed what they call the network address, or think of it as your street name. And then the last number in each of those sets is unique, which identifies the individual computer. So that's basically how they talk to each other. Oh, I guess I had that already in there. I just hadn't clicked forward. So the network or street address is the first 3, and what they call the host or the house address would be the last one. So when you want to start connecting multiple networks, you just expand that idea. So each set of the networks here, let's see if we can get the mouse pointer going around. You'll see that 192.168, you got a 0, you've got a 1, so those are the different streets, if you will, or clusters of houses, and you got 2 and 3 on the bottom, and then of course individual house numbers on the bottom. And they're all connected via what's called TCP or IP networking. So once they know that, hey, you're over here on this street, if this guy wants to send you something, basically they send it through the network and it routes it over to your street, to your house, to your PC on that side. And then of course, once they started connecting computers together and everyone started talking, there were people that had nothing better to do that needed some more work that really started figuring out that they could do things that really weren't advantageous to the rest of us. So the advent of firewalls came up to as a necessity, basically to keep people from doing things they weren't supposed to. Keep honest people honest. So each network would have its own firewall and only allow the traffic in that was permitted to pass. And of course, now we have the internet, which everything's connected through. So going wireless, we take that wired aspect and we just simply change it over to a wireless aspect. We got rid of the slide is what we did. Nothing like trying to hold on to it and going too far. Okay, so here, all we've done is we put a radio transmitter in the computer and one in the central router, and they're talking over radio waves instead of an actual hardware wire connection.
On ham frequencies.
On ham or not, it works the same. And that's actually one of the nice things, if you've worked with the handheld radio side of ham radio and in disasters and MCOM, there's a lot of different ways that you can make computers talk over ham radio, separate from HamWAN. But then you get into things like TNCs and a lot of different configuration niceties, we'll call them. One of the advantages of this is that you're using the same tools that you use in your daily life. So you don't necessarily have to become a TNC expert or a UHF or VHF interfacing expert to TNCs to make it work for things like WinLink or otherwise. You could use the same tools that you use on a daily basis. So there are some limitations to the wireless world. And if you've used this in a hotel or at home or whatever, you've encountered these. You get so far out in the yard or so far down the neighborhood, it doesn't work anymore, at least not to the spot that you're trying to hit. Open wireless, standard 2.4 gigahertz wireless, theoretical maximum range is around 1,300 feet in clear space. no interruptions, no walls, no trees, no nothing. It's significantly lower than that whenever you start throwing things in between point A and B. Walls, appliances, your body, you get between the transmitter and receiver, you can knock that down rather quickly. You get a couple 100 feet, you're gonna be lucky. Multiple units, so if you happen to live in an apartment building, you can see everyone's wireless hotspots. They can see yours. The more of them that are out there, you've got 13 channels of wireless basically, depending upon the frequency that you're using. And guess what? If you've got 50 units trying to use 13 channels, there's gonna be a problem. So that's one of the things that comes into play. And I just repeated myself, or I got ahead of it there, so there you go. So HamWAN basics. We already kind of talked about this a little bit. Regular wireless at 2.4 or 5.8 gigahertz. The difference with HamWAN, we have different frequencies available to us. HamWAN itself, for the most part, uses 5.9. We do have people in other HamWAN implementations, notably down in Florida, that have been using 3 gigahertz. And actually, we'll talk a little bit later, 24 gigahertz is actually in use in Seattle. So, touch on that a little bit. Going miles instead of feet. Well, we talked about the limitations of wireless. 1,300 feet under ideal conditions, you start throwing walls and concrete and appliances and the refrigerator in the way, it goes down pretty quick. So how do we get HamWAN out over miles? Well, the answer is higher power radios, higher power antennas. This little rubber ducky that's on your HT that is on the same thing as your little wireless router at home doesn't get you very much power output. It's basically enough to get what's in the radio out and going. When you start using different antennas like the dish on the right hand side there, if I can get my mouse pointer to move, that type of antenna will get you about what they call 30 dB of gain. So it's amplifying your incoming and outgoing signal quite a bit over what the radio itself, which is this little box down here, that is basically analogous to the same Wi-Fi router that you have at home. The only difference is you might be putting out 200 or 500 milliwatts at the home unit or something off the shelf for consumer use, and this is putting out a full watt, 1 to 1.3 watts. Some of the models go up to 2. So this is what you might put on an EOC or a location such as this that you want to hook into what you call a cell site or a central distribution location. And these antennas, if I can get the mouse to move again, right here are what they call sector antennas. They're rectangular, and with a shield, they're about that wide, they're about that tall, and we usually put 3 of them on a mountaintop. Each one will cover 120 degrees of the compass. 3 times 120 is 360, so you get full coverage unidirectionally there. But they split that up into 3 different antennas. Those antennas themselves only have about 19 dB of gain. It's just due to the design. So basically higher power, higher gain antennas, and less competition on those frequencies is one of the things that allows us to go miles instead of feet. We've been able to do links over 100 miles in length over these off of this equipment. Basically a 30 dB antenna to a 30 dB antenna. Our longest running link on a regular basis was from Haystack Mountain, which is east of Everett, up in Washington State, ran 91.9 miles to Victoria, British Columbia. And we are running about 50 to 60 megabits across that connection on a regular basis. Closer in, you don't have as far to go, you can actually push well over 100 megabits. So you can get some pretty good speed out of the equipment. Why is that important? Well, if we start looking at the available ham radio gear for doing digital communication, there's some limitations. There's also some advantages to it. If you hook up your little handheld radio to a computer, it is possible to send emails or even small files from a laptop like this with a handheld radio to another laptop with a handheld radio. It just goes dog slow. Back in the day, before we had all these large pictures that we take with our cell phones that we want to send out to everybody, you know, showing the kids and, you know, the fact that they bruised their head like my nephew did last night running into the bathtub. His first trip, 18 months old, to the ER happened last night. Woohoo, kids. Those pictures take quite a while to send. If you're trying to send a disaster assessment that is something other than a text message, that method of transmission is going to take quite a while. If you use what's called a VHF packet radio setup, the maximum speed, anyone remember dial-up modems? Okay, that's what we're talking here. VHF packet is a very slow dial-up modem, basically 1200 baud. 25 minutes for a 200K email or a 1 meg photo might take as long as a couple hours to send that way. Now, compared to HamWAN, yes, HamWAN can get that there in a heartbeat. HamWAN is limited to line of sight because you're operating at higher frequencies. Those higher frequencies, just like regular Wi-Fi, if you have to go through a rain-soaked tree or a bunch of them or a bunch of walls or a mountaintop, you're not going to get there. So there are certain situations where that little packet radio really shines because you know what? He doesn't have to have line of sight. It may take him forever, but he's going to beat the rabbit as a turtle. So UHF packet radio is a step up. It's higher frequency, so that 1200 becomes 9600, and your 2 hours drops to about 16 minutes for transferring that 1 meg photo. Dial-up internet, if you actually get the old modems at high speed, that whopping 56K modem, if you remember that, drops your 16 minutes down to 2.7. And then you start getting into the different flavors of internet connections, DSL cable, and different speeds of HamWAN connections. And really, that 1 meg photo doesn't take any time. You can do that in a couple of seconds. Where you really start seeing it is when you start looking at the larger attachments, either a 10 meg in size or multiple pictures, and then you really start seeing, okay, a 50 meg connection or even a 6 meg connection, 14 seconds is a lot better than 2.5 hours. So everything is a different tool, has its place. HamWAN is not a solution for absolutely every place and every situation, but it's a great tool to have. Some of the pros and cons of different things, the various packet capabilities. You can go up to 20 miles, but you don't need line of sight. Slower speed, you need somebody who's more proficient in making that technology work together and work from one end to the other. So some pros and cons of that. D-Star, another amateur technology, digital technology, ICOM product. Good coverage. It's able to link to and through the internet. It also doesn't need line of sight. And you can go from 9600 up to 128 kilobit, which is some decent speed. But again, you got to have specialized equipment. It's a bit more friendly out of the box. Yes, sir.
The 128 kilobit of D-Star, you will lose on line of sight because it's 1.2 gig.
Yeah. 1.2 is a little bit more forgiving in some, but yes. You can have a little bit of masking in 1.2 or 900 meg. We actually have done some fair amount of 900 megahertz experimentation to try and deal with the tree coverage issues to see if we can get some greater capability there. And then of course, the high speed stuff, it's kind of like the freeway system. HamWAN, yeah, you can go mile a minute if the freeway's open, if you've got line of sight, but you do need that line of sight. It's better for fixed installation locations. So if you can get a good mountaintop and you've got a bunch of places that actually can see that mountaintop, then it's a fantastic solution. The organization itself, established back in 2013, so it's fairly young by ham standards. It is a nonprofit. We have a bunch of different people that contribute to the effort. Nobody gets paid out of it. In fact, we donate more than we ever got paid, and that'll probably always be the same way. We do have a subset of the public internet space that has been allocated to us, which really doesn't mean anything if you're not a tech weenie or something of that sort. So you can sleep through that portion. HamWAN versus Puget Sound Data Ring. This is kind of HamWAN is the recognized term. We actually have two different sections of the group. One is actually the Puget Sound Network. HamWAN itself is more a standards organization. We test things, we kind of figure out how the best way to put them together is to work. We publish those standards out, and then different people like yourselves that are interested can look at that and decide, hey, this would work for us or it doesn't. HamWAN has installations that we don't manage in many different states. Down in Tampa, Florida, of course, the Puget Sound Ring, Memphis, Tennessee, up in British Columbia, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Oregon, Hawaii, and then of course Georgia as well. So HamWANs have sprung up in many different places. What is it? It's basically wireless radio modeled after a cellular network, is kind of the best way to think of it. If you go down the freeway, you see the little towers with the antennas hanging off of them. Those are your cell towers. You scatter them out all the way along, and then you can maintain coverage as you drive up and down the freeway. We take a different approach because you can't drive very well far down the highway anywhere in the Pacific Northwest without a mountain getting in the way. So we jack them up on top of the hills where they can see a lot more territory, and then we try to link those to where they can talk to each other, and then wherever they can see down to, we can actually connect to and trade traffic. Let's see. We've got individual hams, EOCs, hospitals. We can go through quite a list of things that have been connected. The thing that we shoot for, even though everyone associates it with, hey, backup internet. Well, you got to remember it's on amateur frequencies. So there's a lot of those internet related things that you can't technically do without getting into arguing semantics with the government or someone with deeper pockets that can make your life miserable even if you're right. So the real goal is to build communication communities like what you guys are talking about here. You put something up on the coin tower that can actually cover quite a bit of Portland. Even if that is not able to tie out to the rest of the world, and you can still talk amongst yourselves, it goes a long way towards solving problems locally. You know, you can call someone up and say, hey, we got a bridge out here. How do we get back and forth? Or we need some medical help over here. How do your hospitals get services back and forth? Those are great things to have answers to. Microwave alignment. Microwave is basically anything over a certain frequency. It's just radio frequencies. And what we're talking about is we have those dishes that I was showing earlier pointed from one mountaintop to another. Well, so does the government, so does business. Everyone has a microwave of one kind or another. They just use different frequencies. If something starts shaking, it's not a real stretch to realize that some of that stuff can get shaken out of alignment. So can HamWAN. Well, how can we take care of that? Well, in one respect, some commercial and government microwave systems are very, very focused. What they call their beam width, or is how wide they can see. It's kind of like standing here and trying to hit the dot on that box on the wall with a laser pointer. Okay? If you're too high a precision and you get shaken out of alignment, you're off that thing pretty quick. Instead of hitting the dot, if I only have to hit the box itself, I can take a little bit of shaking. Okay? It's still going to see and make that connection. So the beam width of the equipment comes into play, and we're pretty decent on that. Ours is fairly forgiving. You can be off a little bit and it'll still connect. It'll work at a lower speed, but lower speed is better than no speed. The other thing is too, is that like a lot of other places, when we can, we like to locate on facilities that are actually built to seismic standards. So that, you know, if it's on top of my garage, there's no guarantee that thing's gonna be in alignment with anything by the time it gets done shaking. Because if I built the garage might not be standing after things get done shaking. However, if it's on one of the commercial locations that has been built to seismic standards, or government locations, DNR locations, there's a lot better likelihood that that tower was engineered and the footings are there and the terrain is such that it's been checked out that it's not gonna move as much during a major event. So selecting your locations is definitely key. The other piece that comes into play, having multiple links to those locations. So if one gets shaken out, you've got 2 or 3 others that the path can be made and maintained. So that little bit on microwave alignment there. Current map of the system, which looks okay, but there's a lot of empty space in there. What you find though is a lot of that empty space is not highly populated. Once you get up into the mountains themselves, most of the metro areas are pretty well covered with the exception of the Washington coast and Pacific County down in here. And then you can see the Portland area down off of what we call Larch Mountain, which is northeast of town, is what's covering this area right now. That's the network just as a quick view. Capabilities, high-speed links capable of supporting pretty much anything you use today. You can stream video over it, you can do webcams, you can do what they call voice over IP telephone systems. One of the things that we have right now is we can actually pick up and do a 4-digit dial to any connected hospital or EOC that's on the network, just like you're picking up your cell phone. It rings right on the desk, you pick it up. Long distance links, we've done up to 100 miles, we've done up to 100 megabits between major sites. That actually has been blown away. We'll touch on that in a little bit. Typical though is probably in the 10 to 40 megabit between client sites. One of the fun ones that we had, we were testing out a hospital a few years ago, went up on top of the roof, and we had an A-frame ladder that was about 10 feet high, and we decided, okay, what can we do? And it was one of the original grid dishes, which is only a single channel. It's about that big, open grid mesh with a radio attached to it, and literally sitting on the ladder, holding it in the direction, got the signal peaked, and we're surfing YouTube videos with a handheld antenna pointed at the county's emergency operations center. So that was kind of fun. 10 to 40 megabit being more typical, comparing to DSL, which runs anywhere from 1.5 to 12 megabit, and cable 5 to 50. Of course, those numbers keep changing, so pick the ones that you want. What can it do? Well, it can do a lot of things other than just typical what you jump on your PC to do. It can link repeaters, is one of the biggest things. A lot of the DMR network throughout Washington is running over HamWAN connections. If you go to put a repeater on a mountaintop site and you can't get a cable or a DSL line up there, it's a lot easier to pop a dish up there, a couple of antennas, and run an Ethernet connection down to your repeater, and then you can tunnel across the internet with it. Echolink, IRLP, they use the same technology. We run an APRS iGate off of our club's repeater in downtown Everett. In fact, we also run, the two repeaters run Echolink and Fusion over them as well, and all of that traffic goes over HamWAN links. Let's see. If you're a geek in the amateur radio side, you get an opportunity to actually experiment with things like antenna designs, how microwave actually performs. We take running graphs of how the system performs, so if you have a nasty storm come through and you want to see what happens with rain or snow fade, or when an antenna ices over on a mountaintop, you can actually read that in real-time graphs. If you want to play with different antenna designs and see how well, you could do that too. So, you want to learn and develop IT skills, you get a lot more IT than you really probably want out of it, but you can go as far as deep as you'd like to. MCOM, or emergency communications uses. We already talked about most of these. Voice over IP phones, the ability to simply, instead of routing that message form from the EOC down to the radio room, well, one, that never happens because, like I said, if you're in an EOC, unless it is an active ham radio environment, you go to a hospital and you tell them, hey, we need you to route traffic down to the radio room. They'll give you a blank look. Fill out this form so you can send a message over to your other hospital. Oh, we ain't got time for that. One of those things that seldom gets exercised. If they can pick up an actual telephone, dial it, and talk to them, guess what? You just saved the day. Same thing, done differently. They're more familiar with that. Email and web access, we already talked most about these. Real-time video, email attachments and document sharing. These are things that you can put onto your network that people can make use of. So as an example, we were discussing earlier, this voice over IP telephone, our main phone system is in downtown Seattle. Well, you guys are setting up a network portion down here that doesn't really help in a major event if that connection between Larch Mountain and Seattle goes down. So it makes a lot more sense to put a telephone system down here such that In the worst case, if the network does break up into smaller clusters in a major event, you can still talk amongst each other with everyone that's within range of that one location, or the 2 or 3 that you might have eventually that are linked together. Make sense? Tactical chat systems. We're all used to grabbing our phone and either text messaging or Facebook or fill in the blank. You know, those quick little messages, OMW, you know, I'm on my way. Well, you can actually do that over these systems as well. It's just sending more traffic. You just need to come up with an app or something that you want to be able to use. You can just send those messages to. You want to send something from this facility to another church location somewhere else? If they're both on the location, all you need is a PC in each one that's hooked to it. You can be sending text messages back and forth, whether it's email or just straight text. And the rest of that's more geek stuff. Other uses, backup data and communications for hospitals and operations centers. It's another path. How do we do that at high speed? Ham radio has a lot of tools, a lot of things it can do. It's not always the most end user friendly. It's not always necessarily the fastest. So this is one that gives you a little bit of better capability in certain situations. You got to have that line of sight. One thing it does do though, where you have it, if you do get the radio room in a facility busy, instead of having to tie up their radios for 2 hours to send a picture, they can actually spend that 2 hours talking to people around the town to find out what else is going on, if you can pull that load off of them. So it's another avenue where it helps them work. One that hasn't really been exploited, there's been a merger of radio and computers. And the geeks in the crowd will know this, but not everyone else will. What they call SDR, or software-defined radio. Okay? If you take a radio, whether it's the radio in your car or a ham radio, you have to tune to a certain frequency to use it. You want to listen to a radio station, you got to be on that radio station. Well, in a disaster, how do you know that someone's on that radio station, that it's actually working? You don't until you tune there. With the marriage of computers and radios, instead of listening to a single frequency, what they do is they take all of that radio frequency, all of those frequencies coming in, comes into an antenna, and they turn it into a computer, and it processes everything. So if you take the car radio analogy, you can have a waterfall display of every station that's active on your FM radio at the same time. So you know where to tune. When you take that into the ham radio space, it's the same thing. If you've got radio repeaters out there, you've got different activities, which ones are working? If you can look at the entire spectrum, not only that, not only can you look at it, you can record it, the entire 2-meter band, or UHF band, 70 centimeters, at the same time. So now if you're in a disaster situation and you can only tune to one frequency, but you want to go and find out what's going on in these other places, if you have one of these software-defined receivers, you can actually go back and listen to those recordings. So it's a great way to keep up on the news. You can do a lot of other tools. It gets into a lot more geek, and there's too many people bouncing their heads off the table already. So for those that are really excited about that kind of thing, we can continue that in email. The other one that was up there was remotely operating radios. So you can actually, a radio that's attached to a computer, you can connect to it and actually run the radio. If I wanted to, I could attach to my radios up in my radio room up in Washington from here, and I could communicate overseas quite easily. How reliable? Mountaintop sites, backup power on most, if not all of the key sites, multiple connections to the public internet. So we have a lot of major connections in and out of the internet. Our biggest one is right out of the West End building, which is a major hub in downtown Seattle. But if we lose that one, we can route through BC or potentially through Oregon someday, wherever we have another connection. If we lose a link to a mountaintop, it automatically switches gears to a remaining link if it's got more than one. What can't it do? Some of these will generate more arguments than they're worth. Like most of ham radio, you can't conduct business over it. You just can't. It's against the rules. You can't do that. Disaster communications only, everything falls under FCC Part 97. It doesn't connect to somebody's in-house IT infrastructure, which is a big one if you've ever had to work with government or hospitals. Understandably, if you have your medical records and all of your private medical history, you don't necessarily want any Joe Schmuckatelli, whether he's good intentioned or not, hooking his computer to that hospital network. And we all know how it works when even they have dedicated IT staff trying to keep your information private. So the good part is we don't want to hook to their stuff. So it becomes a lot more friendly to the in-house IT staff and to the HIPAA regulations. It does not replace your existing amateur radios. Like we said, there are certain things that regular radios can do that HamWAN can't, but it's a great tool for the tool belt. You can't encrypt it in order to stay compliant with regulations. That's one that can generate a lot of interesting arguments because it's an argument for another day. However, the reality is we do have to operate under that because no matter what level of arguments you come up with, you're going to be fighting the government. And whether you're right or not, that's not a fight you're going to win. So, mountaintop coverage. We're just going to fly through some of these. This is kind of the a little bit of the north end view. Victoria, British Columbia. That's this location over here. They actually have two hubs. One is on a mountaintop higher than Victoria. Lookout, right here is the Canadian border coming across. So Lookout is south of Bellingham. And then we have locations down in Puget Sound, Seattle, Painfield, and Everett, coming down through Capitol Peak, Capitol Park, Olympia, Baffa, and then over here to Larch. So those are just a lot of the cities that are covered up there. Now to something a little bit more near and dear to your hearts, Portland, Vancouver area. These names you should probably recognize a little bit more than the ones that were on the last slide. Portland, Vancouver, Gresham Shore, and I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this right, Felida. Baker, Mount Vista, Walnut Grove, Five Corners, Government Island, Hayden Island, Laurelhurst Park, REA, Washougal, Fern Prairie. That's just picking names out of the coverage area. So you can see that this ridge that you're probably fairly familiar with if you're working with radio in the area stops a lot of the coverage path at that point. The ridge is higher than the large mountain location, so you don't have that line of sight. It's over the ridge from it, so that's why the coverage pattern stops.
The other interesting thing about that is you see shadows of some of the major hills like Kelly Butte. You see it cast that big white shadow. What's that? Mount Tabor. I'm sorry, Mount Tabor cast that big white shadow there.
Yep. This is too down close to the river, so it's shadowed by the shoreline immediately to the north. So yeah, anywhere where you see white inside the patterns, you're being shadowed by something. Now, the tools that you can use, and we'll jump into this at the end here, there's tools you can go online and play with that are wonderful. You know, they're very similar, or they're based off of Google Maps. You can actually put a point on a mountaintop and say, hey, where will this cover? Where will this cover? Oh, this will cover, hey, I can see that mountaintop over there. Well, that's another point to put an uplink, you know, to connect the two and then start expanding your network. So extending the Oregon coverage, connecting your client sites. So now we start looking at, well, this isn't coming out as good as I'd hoped. Contrast isn't that wonderful. So this is the Portland coverage via Larch Mountain. And if you look at the yellowish, that's the coverage pattern coming off of Larch Mountain. Done a little bit differently. We've pulled out the terrain and we're more looking at the maps. Anything that's shaded here is something that you can see from Larch Mountain. I'm trying to pick out. So south of Wilsonville is right here. Tigard is in this area. Beaverton's up here. So those three areas are fairly well shadowed from Larch Mountain. Portland itself, when you start looking down into the eastern side over toward Gresham, Government Island, those got some decent coverage. Once you get past Wilsonville, there's another whole section. Salem is right down here on the bottom corner. So coming up from Salem along the I-5 corridor, you've got some fairly decent coverage into that area. So that's Larch Mountain. Now we start looking at what you guys are working on with the KOIN tower. You'll notice that, one, the color's purple, so it's a bit easier to see than that yellow that was blending in. But two, the coverage patterns aren't that drastically different. So even though you're on top of the ridge on this side, it's not that much different. If we look at it here, you have a bit more coverage in the Beaverton-Tigard area. Wilsonville itself proper is still in a hole. So you get a fair amount more coverage in this area. This is very similar to what was shown off of the Larch Mountain site. The other thing that does happen a little bit is you get a little bit better coverage in certain spots in the low-lying areas down here. But you do have a shadow that didn't exist with Larch, pardon me, over by Government Island. So what do we need to get started? Well, it depends on what you're doing. If you're connecting a single endpoint, or what we call a client site, that's one set of equipment. If you're going to redistribute to a local area like the KOIN tower, that's what we would call a cell site. And if you're linking or relaying just from one cell site to another, it's kind of a little bit of a hybrid. It's a third different situation. So if you're just connecting your own house or a single facility, I term this as your average ham connection. And the reason I say that is it's the bare radios. It leaves the IT networking up to you. You can get a firewall from Best Buy, from Amazon, from wherever, hook it up however you want. This is for a low RF zone, and the reason I say that, you get a 30 dB dish and you get a radio that allows you to connect to it. Total is about 215 bucks. The problem with this radio, it works great, but it has a plastic case. So if you put this on a mountaintop somewhere next to a multiple 100-watt paging amplifier or something like that, those other frequencies will fry that radio. Yes, I have stories. Now, thankfully, if you go up another $30, you can get basically the same radio in a metal enclosure. Ground that thing and you're not going to have the problem. So not a huge difference in price, but it's a difference in capability there. So if you have higher RF in the area that you're setting this up, if you're talking average, business location or a home, most of either one's going to work fine. There are also some lesser expensive options that we'll talk about in a moment. But this is what we use up in the Puget Sound area. These same dishes and modems and cases we can use them with a couple of tweaks between our client locations and what we call our cell sites or linking mountaintops. So other low-cost options, we have a client hardware page on the website up there. You can get as low as $41 or as high as $350. So there's a whole range of equipment that will work. Each set of equipment has trade-offs. If you have a radio and antenna that's capable of 24 dB communication or RF power output compared to one that can do 30, that's a 6 dB difference. Doesn't sound like much, a difference of 6, but for every 3 dB, you cut the actual effective RF power in half. So if you do 3 dB twice, your 24 is 75% less power than your 30. So it depends upon where you're at in proximity to what you're trying to connect to. If you're in one of those areas real close to the tower, you can get one of the cheaper ones and hook up in a heartbeat. It's a lot less space, it's a lot less obtrusive, and it'll work up and hook up just fine. If you're further out or have more speed that you wish, one of the higher end ones is going to be better suited for your situation. The big thing out of all of this, you can't just go on Amazon and order it unless you know for sure which one you're getting. In the United States, all of the consumer wireless gear, Wi-Fi gear, is sold according to US regulations. We as amateurs use international frequencies, the ham frequencies. Those are not covered by typical US equipment. You have to get the equipment that is international, or what they call ROW, or rest of the world configured. So you need the international versions of the equipment. So when we're hooking up an EOC or a hospital, this is what we tend to look at. We look at a single 30 dB dish, a metal enclosed radio. We have a couple of routers down here, and a voice over IP phone. And you can make changes on that depending upon what you're setting up as your goals and your networking. This is what we tend to work with up there. Main reason for that, your rack mount router tends to be your switch if you ever go to add more links. So if you're doing a basic single point install, that works great unless that mountaintop that that's pointed at, or that particular dish, has a problem. If you go to the next level up and you have two different links, a county EOC, you might want to have two different links. Then you can actually do some failover routing through this router or this switch on the bottom. And the one with the handy dandy Wi-Fi is just that. If you want to be able to put an antenna up here, hook it up to a tower, it's nice if the wire comes down and plugs into this computer sitting right here. But if I have my own wireless hotspot, y'all can hook your cell phones to it and do whatever you need to. In theory, we're not supposed to use it for regular internet, but the idea is, in a disaster, you can more easily hook everyone into that circuit and communicate. I should have backed up. So that whole setup there, you're talking around the $500 to $600 mark, $575 plus shipping. So whereas you were down in the 200s for a single connection, when you start talking hospitals, EOCs, there's some advantage to getting some funding for going up. If you start adding multiple dishes, it's just the additional cost. You start looking at $900 to $1,100 plus shipping, depending on what you're hooking up. The cell site, what you're looking at doing at KOIN, $2,500 to $4,500. Those numbers start getting bigger, especially if we're looking at trying to pay for those out of our own pockets. It's a reality. It's a wide range, and the reason is, it depends on how many of these you have. There's also some other things that come into play beyond what you see here, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But this is kind of the minimum that we would do at a cell site. 2 links in and out, that way if one dies, we still have one path, and then the basic capability for the 3 sectors or 360 degrees coverage beyond that. Now, you guys have a lot of stuff that you've been looking at that is a lot more pocketbook friendly for getting connected. You're looking at $60, $70, $80. This is a mount at $15, and then some cabling to connect it up. Definitely a lot more pocketbook friendly for trying to do something as an individual. Like I said, there's trade-offs. These have different, little bit lower gain on some of them. So again, if you're close into the communications, the cell site should work fine. But that's one of those things when you go to pick something and hook something up, hopefully as you get going, you'll have a model or 2 of each around that you can see what works better for your location. Up north, I have 4 or 5 pieces of gear that one's still on a hospital that is a loaner gear. They're actually gonna be this summer putting in a full cell site off of it. So I'll eventually get it back. So you have different equipment that you can look at. We talked about the differences in gain or power levels and some of the trade-offs on that. So again, if you want a copy of the presentation, you'll have that and you can look at other items. So that $2,500 to $4,500, we talked about that being quite a range, and it is. This is some of the other stuff that gets thrown in when you start putting in a site that you don't necessarily, they're kind of soft costs. You really don't know how much it's going to be unless you've done a few and once you start speccing it out. How much cable am I going to need to connect all of that stuff? Well, if you're going 200 feet up a tower, you figure once you get up there, you might have to go 30 feet over and around the tower to get to where you're going to mount your radio. And then once you get to the bottom, you might have to go 50, 60 feet to get into the building, and then another 30 feet inside the shack before you can actually hook it to something and power it up. So now you're talking 300 feet of wire by the time you get done. Well, times 3 sectors, times 2 point-to-points, you're now at, what was that, 300 times 5, 1,500 feet of wire. So 1,000-foot boxes, a couple of those. Hardware for mounting stuff to the towers of the buildings, all of this stuff. Oh, and how does that wire come down the tower? Well, it's got to be secured. You just can't let it flap in the breeze. They kind of get a little irritated about that. And zip ties do not work long term. Duct tape works a little better, but it too will deteriorate over time. And the second site that went online, Snohomish County's emergency management facility, was zip tied. It got replaced a couple years ago when all those zip ties started dying from the ultraviolet light and the cables were flapping on the side of the tower. So even if you think you know what you're doing, there's still lessons to learn. Lightning protection's another one. Having lightning arresters on there,
Were
but
they
thankfully.
black zip ties or white ones?
What's that?
Were they black or white zip ties?
Uh-huh.
Both?
Either one will degrade. Firewalls, I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on here. There are some differences between your consumer stuff. The short version is, if you're only gonna hook up a single dish, your stuff from Best Buy, Amazon, whatever you can buy off the shelf will work perfectly fine to protect you. You probably have a spare, especially if you've got a ham at home, you have a spare somewhere. But we won't talk too much about that because, well, I can because my wife is a ham and she knows my problem. So, now, if you're gonna start hooking up more than one link at a location, then's when you start getting into problems with the off-the-shelf stuff. Your regular Linksys or D-Link or whatever type router that you buy from Amazon, yeah, you stick out your tongue. I mean, they're out there, whether we like them or not, you know. They only have one port to plug in to an external connection to your cable system or your DSL line. When you start having 2 or 3 or 4 links out, you need something that can actually adapt to all of those. And so that's why we go back to some of the MikroTik gear. It's capable of doing that. So, getting to the end. Everyone able to stay awake? Do we need to jump up, do some jumping jacks, fresh water, caffeine? Okay. Bathroom break. If you need to, just bolt for it. So this is kind of the piece where you guys are looking to do something that a lot of communities haven't gotten to the point of undertaking. It's a little bit of guidance on maybe how to go about it, because in reality, you're not trying to put in and compete with internet providers, even though under the best conditions, it can do the internet. What you're looking to do is build a communications community. How can you function when the rest of the world goes in the tank? Well, if you're dual linking your key sites, so you've got an emergency, this is also known as fun with clip art. Yeah, hey, you start running out of pictures, you start cruising the internet of things to use. So EOC sitting here, if it's got 2 different paths to 2 different mountaintops, you've got a pretty good assurance there that, hey, if one goes down, you're still gonna be able to talk to somebody. Same thing for a hospital. Well, if we start talking that on a community basis, you got things like City Hall, hospital, businesses, police, fire, all of these different locations, school district, the schools themselves. Many of these individual locations may not have the ability to look at a particular mountaintop. In fact, I would guarantee that most of them won't. However, a lot of them can look at each other. So when you start looking to build a communications infrastructure that the community can use, your tower locations are definitely key, but the other thing to start putting on the map is, who would you like to talk to? Who do you need to talk to? City Hall, police, fire, public works, school district, all of those entities that would come together that would need to talk to each other to solve problems in a disaster. Start putting those on your map. Because once you start talking to them and helping them understand this whole concept, it's a lot easier to say, not only would we like to communicate, but we have these 8 other locations that would like to communicate as well. Oh, we can't get there? Well, we have a building over here that we could probably put an antenna on. Instead of trying to solve all the world's problems by yourselves, enlist them to help solve them for you. Everett, Washington is a very good example, and we can't really see a lot of it here. You can see the green surrounding. This is downtown Everett. It's a big gray shadow, and our actual link is the County Emergency Management Facility out at Payne Field in Everett over here. It sits on a hilltop. Everett sits in a hole. Sound familiar? Okay, so we can see the major medical center just barely up here on the edge of the green. All of this, which is County Red Cross, 3 more hospital locations, County Health District, and numerous fire departments are all not covered. So we started looking at alternatives. This is a view from another mountaintop, Haystack Mountain, quite a bit out east. You can see a lot of this area is covered, but what you can't see as well is there's quite a bit of this in here that isn't. And then you also have a shadow north of what's called Payne Field here. So when we start looking at how to fill this in, we say, okay, what about this medical center that was up here that was barely in the coverage from emergency management? Turns out, if we put a cell site on that, guess what? All of downtown is covered. Not only that, what their interest in doing it is this other medical center that they have over here in the corner that wasn't covered by either of them. They just became a player that filled in your network. The other 2 medical centers down here in South Everett, they also became connected. If we actually ran a reverse site off of those, you could also fill in downtown, but you got a bit of a hole right there. The fun part is when you start combining all these maps. A lot of different colors, and when you put them all together, it's like a kindergarten class that got turned loose with a bunch of watercolors. Almost every part of the map is filled in from somewhere. That's what you want to try and accomplish. And with that kind of coverage, you could have every police, every fire department, every hospital in that map talking to each other with a 4-digit phone call. So getting the community involved, talk to City Hall, Public Works. It's not going to happen on your first visit. You guys have played with people like this before. You know, how long does it even take them to remember who you were the 6th time that you were there? Okay? But what'll happen is you get a decent presentation together, you start small. Hey, we got this going on. We'd like to show you a map when you have time. Show up at a meeting. Find out who their emergency manager is. Give them some information on how you can help them solve their problem. If you're not asking for something and you have an opportunity that you can show them that's not going to cost them too much, most of these people, most businesses that are making the money, not just collecting it from us taxpayers and spending it, most businesses don't have a full-time emergency manager, let alone most cities and local governments. Usually it's a portion of duties that are added on to someone's existing job, and that person left 3 layoffs ago, and it hasn't. Somebody else just inherited it, and they haven't got up to speed. So no, they can't find you a budget, but you know what? They can find $500, and that looks like it'll work, and it gets corporate off of their tail. When they finally start getting pressure from someone, they'll remember your name, or they'll remember that you were there, and they'll start asking around, who was that guy that was talking to me about this? It may take 2 or 3 years to make it happen, but it will. That coverage map, we started in 2013 as the first one. We cover most of Western Washington today, and that was in under 6 years. Not bad. So, city and county public works, other key facilities. Public works you probably won't get time of day from until emergency management or city government can connect the dots for you. But it never hurts to ask. If you get time with one of those sets of folks, mention public works. Because if they've ever done any disaster drills, they'll know that, hey, communications always stinks. If you can solve that problem for me, because public works is responsible for fixing dang near everything. In a major disaster. School district, who has the facilities for doing sheltering or gathering the population when there's a problem? It's the school district. Child safety, things of that nature. School facilities are always big on the city's priority list for being able to make use of. If you can show that you can connect those and communicate between them, it's another feather in your cap. Police, fire, Utilities and Red Cross fill in the list. Planning this thing, get your addresses. You can convert those to GPS coordinates. We can actually plot them right on a map for you and show you what's actually covered today versus what could be covered tomorrow, or if we light up this particular location, you can do a lot of what ifs. There's a lot of geek tools online. I'll show you one here briefly, CalTopo, those maps, the coverage maps that have been scattered throughout here, those were done with that. We can actually do some what ifs on that. A tool called Radio Mobile is another tool that you can do. If something's blocking a location, you can actually use, hey, what's that? And find out what's blocking that line of sight. Oh, it's this mountain and there's no way I'm gonna get around it, so I might as well quit trying. I need to find another location. Somebody who's actually willing, or a site that's willing to let you in, that's always a challenge. These locations, everyone is looking for. There's a lot of competition for them. One of the things that's helped us out greatly is most of these sites also have a lot of people that are wanting to connect their sites into the internet. Well, if you don't have a reliable DSL or a Comcast cable connection up to that mountaintop, well, guess what? We might be able to help you with that. Other considerations, credentialing, depending upon where you're getting into. If you're getting into a government or highly secure, we have one facility that we lit up last year, well actually two of them. One was the Washington State Department of Emergency Management at Camp Murray. They tend to be a little protective of that. They want to know who you are coming and going, so sometimes credentialing can be an issue for things like that. Don't ask me why having the state guard there is not enough, but okay, whatever. Hospitals in some respects, you know the drill. You may have to get some extra credentials to be allowed in and out. IT awareness, we really don't want them involved, but in many respects they do need to be aware. If you're going to put something into a hospital or a government facility that doesn't go through their traditional IT infrastructure, at a minimum, if you're going into an EOC, you don't want Joe Blow deciding that, hey, I can just jack into this router and I can get online with my state-owned computer. It's like, no, 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 no. Yes, it'll work, but you don't want state-owned assets or things like, you don't want mixing those environments. You want them pretty well marked. Take care of it up front, you won't have a problem going down the road. Money. I don't know why money's a problem, it just grows on trees. Right? That's what every child grows up thinking, right? I've gotten older, I haven't grown up, but I still know that there was some kind of miscommunication in that growing up. I haven't found it on trees yet. It's a reality. Even if you get to talking to somebody and it's a great idea, you got a lot of enthusiasm, they're on board, the reality is it may not happen for another year or two. They become aware of it today, it may be another year, year and a half before they can get it into a grant or a budget cycle. It's just the nature of the beast. So don't give up. Some of these things just simply take time. Coordination with NetUps on project management. Whoever is going to be your networking backbone folks, whether it's homegrown, whether it's us up north, combination thereof, tower climbers. That's one of the problems that we have up north. All of our guys that started HamWAN back in 2013 are now in their late 30s to late 40s. Guess what? They have little ones running around, much like what we have here. And they have wives with little ones running around that's saying, you aren't not going to climb a tower anymore. I don't know why. Some of them still want to, but that's another, we're not going to make any inferences there. But tower climbers is a big asset and a hard one to come by. So we had kind of this long list of things that the Washington State governor threw out of what we needed in a communication system to allow state government to function after a major event. And again, this is born mostly out of Cascade Rising and those related exercises. Those same exercises that now they're saying 72 is not a good number. 14 to 21 days, that's a much better number. We might be able to get to you then. Oh, great. got button happy again. What you can't see is most of this list is green. There's one item there, which is capacity for handheld devices to participate in the system, and two more down here, ability to connect to National Guard armories and ability to connect to maritime asset communications. Those are the only three out of that entire list that we don't already do today. So this particular directive that you're trying to solve at the government level, we've already got solved. If you want to look at those individual things, technically it's not impossible to connect my handheld device to the system. If I have a wireless router that's connected to a dish off of the top of the building, I can connect my phone to that. I can use Wi-Fi over that. It's technically doable. We just don't do it, and we don't have specs on how to do it and to deal with the encryption issues and all of that. Ability to connect to National Guard armories, the only thing stopping us from doing that is getting in the gate. If they want it there, we'll put one on the roof, not a problem. So it's not really a problem, it's just not done today. Maritime assets, that's a little bit more tricky. 5.9 gigahertz on a bobbing sailboat mast, that's gonna take some work. We might be able to do it with some different frequencies. So that's probably the one true challenge that we haven't really spent much time on. But majority of that list is definitely doable. So how do you get going? There's a lot of different things. You can get on an email list. There's what they call an IRC chat group. If you are a tower climber, you can get involved faster than your head would spin. People would suck you up in a heartbeat. However, tower climber is useless without a ground crew. He's not going to want to climb up and down that tower with every dish. He's going to want to take a rope up, and he's going to want somebody to haul that thing up to him. Because 200-foot climb, that's not really something that you like to do multiple times. It's not even something I would like to do a partial one time. So yeah, if I'm going up there and I'm going to be down, defying gravity and trying not to make that sudden stop at the end, someone else is freighting that gear up to me. So, yep. Site sponsors, people that are willing to, help out with the cause to get coverage places, tower locations. You don't need a tower. If you've got a mountaintop location, guess what? If you've got a 3,000-foot mountain, as long as you can get above the trees, you don't need a 300-foot tower. That mountain is good enough. As long as you don't have trees in the way, you can sit right on top of the building and it'll work fine. So if the trees start growing, go up with a chainsaw. Never mind. Depends on whose trees. We have been allowed in some certain situations. The one that surprised me actually last year was DNR. I think it was Gold Mountain. We had a crew up there and says, hey, this is starting to get a little high. Bring a chainsaw next time. Alrighty, we're going to file that one. And we're going to make use of it. Software and systems development. Having a connection is one thing. Having effective tools in a disaster that can make use of that is another. So if you like to program, you like to play with software side of things, there's always things that you can do or make things better. Path testing. Can I connect to there from here? If you got a dish, you're willing to travel. I'm actually going to be doing some runs here later this month, and in February, I have a little tow-behind 40-foot portable tower trailer, and that little satellite rotor that I can actually aim my dish from the ground with, and I'm going to go play around up in North Puget Sound and map out some coverages. Use it. Get on board and use it. Have fun with it. That's what the whole point of it is. What does it cost? We already kind of talked about that. That's more just a summary. Okay, so if you made it to the end and you're still awake, time for questions. Wow. Well, you're ARRL. You've been trained on how to stay awake.
Yeah, well, just a big question.
Yep.
I got a board meeting coming up, so I'm practicing for it.
Yep.
You have all these gateways here. Are these things all, is this a closed network? Or somewhere is this thing tied to a gateway that ties to the World Wide Web, or somebody could sit there in a backwoods area and connect your HamWAN and hook it up to his Roku and watch Netflix? I mean, what's to keep that from happening?
What is to keep anyone from misusing repeaters?
Well, nothing.
Honesty.
Honesty. We're a self-policing radio service, and in many respects that applies here. There are some asterisks, so to answer your question, backwoods, yes. Roku and Netflix, no. And technically it is possible to do encrypted traffic across the technology. However, at our gateways going in and out to the public internet, our traffic gets monitored because, for example, one of our largest internet service providers that allows us to connect through them in the Weston, their understanding is this is disaster, this is ham radio, this is not a replacement for an ISP. Now, they know that we have certain websites that we go to for management of the network that will have encryption, SSL. However, if they start seeing Hulu, all of that fun kind of stuff coming out, guess who gets an email or a call? We do. Now, the flip side of that is, there is nothing required. You do not have to fill out a registration in order to connect to a mountaintop. If you know the frequency, you can program and configure your radio, you can connect to it. Amateur identification. When we're using a regular ham radio, HF, UHF, VHF, you're required by law at minimum to ID every 10 minutes or at the end of a conversation. Same thing applies to this. Well, we're not jumping on the Wi-Fi and going, NR30, back to digital, not happening. But what does happen is each radio that's on the system is configured with an ID, much like a repeater. So you will look at Providence Hospital, you will look at a number of locations, and they'll show up as NR30. Just like the repeater, I'm responsible for that communication over that link. So does that give you some toward answering your question?
No, that's perfect.
Okay, cool. Anyone else? So you're all experts, you can all get equipment, hook it up, configure it. Excellent.
So, not a question, but a comment. One of the things that we hope to use this for in disaster communications in the Portland area is if we have towers up in high places, then we can go out in the field with portable setups and set them up where they need to be in the field and communicate with other field locations. Because if we have line of sight to the tower and somebody else has line of sight to the tower, we don't need line of sight to each other.
So we'll get to you in just a moment. I'm going to jump on his while we're there. So one of the advantages of having a major medical center as a centralized hub, not only is just for their benefit, but if you look at a major earthquake, they're going to have to go through and they're going to have to verify that that building is sound. So you're going to have certain activities, triage, things of that nature. People are going to flood those areas because they know that, hey, that's there, they can go there for help. So you will have sheltering activities, you'll have triage areas, things like that. They're going to be set up in the surrounding community. If you know that you can point to the top of that medical center and connect into that with a field unit, it goes a long way. Similar if you can actually hook a hotspot to that and you only give out the ID to those people that are helping run that, you can get word back and forth. One last piece that I've experimented with, and we're going to be hooking this up, is a disaster management web-based platform called Sahana. And there's a lot of things that it can do, but basically your county emergency operations folks use similar tools. They'll have maps that show where a bridge is out, or where a fire is, or a gas main is ruptured, or all of the things that pertain to that particular disaster that they have to track and manage. River over its banks, fill in the thing. There's a platform that we have run up there, similar in nature, but it's not tied to any one organization or entity, so anyone can make use of it. The cool thing that people are interested about from the medical community and others is, well, guess what? You have a major earthquake, what's the first responsibility? You and your family. What is their staff's first responsibility? Them and their family. So a hospital isn't any good if they can't get any staff to stay there. So one of the things that's kind of cool that I've had as a goal is if you could put a connection at each fire station or church or school or multiples, and you can actually publish those throughout the community where families can go and check in and say, hey, I'm all right. They can list the family members, where they're at, whatever information you want to gather. Then you start freeing up people to be able to focus on the secondary needs beyond just their immediate families. Same thing for ham radio operators. Over here, you, sir, and then we'll come get you.
Yeah, you mentioned several times employee tower. Is this serious consideration? Because
Yes.
I've seen that there, and it's a three-legged thing, and unless you put it on the very top, you're not gonna get the 6-degree coverage. You're always gonna be blocked by one leg or another.
Put a sector on each leg.
Secondary antennas, one on each leg? Are they
Between each leg. Then,
Yeah, so we will be, after Rob gets done, we'll be talking about that. But yes, we're actually, coin is the primary place that we're looking at. We're also looking at KGW. The trade-off is that coin, I think we are very close to having a signed agreement to let
What's your
us put it
resolution
there.
on this?
But the problem is they won't let us go as high. If we can get a signed agreement with KGW, we'll be able to go higher on the tower. So what we're trying to do is work with the two organizations. They're within a half a mile of each other, so it's very similar. But we're basically working with those two organizations to see who will let us go higher and give us a signed agreement. But that's what we're working on.
Well, to get the agreement, wouldn't it be helpful if all the clubs in the area were putting pressure on these people to allow it? I mean,
I'll let Ken address that. So let's Rob may have a few more questions, so let's let people ask Rob the questions about what he knows about, and then Ken, I think, can talk about what we're going to be doing in Portland.
Yeah, because I can answer a lot of local questions, but I'll guarantee I won't get most of them right. Yes, sir.
Okay, so the technology has been, it works, it's been proven up in the Seattle area. We're getting some experience here in the Portland area. My question is, you know, when we know the served agencies, the emergency operations centers in the different cities, counties, and so on, we know that they would like communication. And it's been hard for me to form this question, but I guess it boils down to, where's the phone book? How do people know how to get in touch with each? I mean, many of these organizations, maybe someone in the EOC will know that thing, that the HamWAN exists, but will they have any experience with using it? Will they have any capability to make a connection with agencies they'd like to talk to? Where's the phone book?
Sure.
Okay, I might be able to answer that. Basically, what we're going to be doing, whether the system is at COIN or KGW, is there will be a server there connected. It will have web server, email server, voice over IP server, and even if you're completely cut off from the rest of the internet, if you have the ability to connect to the tower, you will be able to access the web server, and there'll be a phone directory there. And it will tell you who you can connect to and what the phone numbers are.
so there really will be a phone book.
Is it in a disaster, if, you know, when we do a set, and we're given a list of the frequencies for the different areas that we talk to, you know, I look for that list of frequencies and agencies each time to know how am I gonna connect in.
So you're going to need to know how to connect to HamWAN to get to that phone book, but that web server is going to have the phone book. It's going to have maps. It's going to have contact information. What we're going to try and do is gather all the information that emergency responders would need, including what ham radio frequencies to use if you're using ham radio rather than HamWAN, and put that all on the server. Because in a disaster, if you can't get to the whole internet, but you can get to one server that has the information you're looking for, that's a valuable resource.
That's a good answer, thank you.
And kind of to contribute a little bit to that, it's a valid question. And one of the perfect examples that we have right now is the voice over IP phone system in Seattle does not have a dynamic phone book, literally a phone book of what is connected, what's available, other than publishing a manual list. That is directly out of the database off of one of the new phone systems that's going in to replace it. If we add an extension to the phone system, it shows up in the web directory. Now, much like what you use at home, other than relying on our own, as we get older, questionable memories, how do we remember to get to the Department of Licensing website, or to our favorite news site, or fill in the blank, or we want to read the Sunday Funnies online? Bookmarks, home pages that have links on them similar in nature. What we typically like to do is, and we're trying to split this up out of Seattle into regional hubs, and what you're discussing down here would make perfect sense, particularly with only one connection going up to the Puget Sound area to start with. A regional hub down here, such that even if you're cut off, the services come up when you connect and you can see what's there. So, anyone else?
Your PBX that's providing that, will that also be on the active directory or the active phone book directories on the actual client units, the phones themselves?
Eventually, yes. But the problem is when you start, we're moving it out to regional. So what would typically make most sense to come up locally would be your local phone directory. When you start talking a few thousand extensions across multiple counties and states, it doesn't really make sense to dump all of those into the phone.
Okay.
So there's some work to be done.
Okay, Rob, maybe one more question and then let's wrap up.
I'm feeling the old shepherd. Anyone else? Going once, going twice. Sold.
Thank you, Rob.
For those of you that just